Scotch whisky, often simply called Scotch, is malt whisky or grain whisky made in Scotland. Scotch whisky must be made in a manner specified by law. All Scotch whisky was originally made from malted barley. Commercial distilleries began introducing whisky made from wheat and rye in the late 18th century. Scotch whisky is divided into 5 distinct categories: single malt Scotch whisky, single grain Scotch whisky, blended malt Scotch whisky, blended grain Scotch whisky, and blended Scotch whisky. All Scotch whisky must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years. Any age statement on a bottle of Scotch whisky, expressed in numerical form, must reflect the age of the youngest whisky used to produce that product. A whisky with an age statement is known as guaranteed age whisky. The first written mention of Scotch whisky is in the Exchequer Rolls of Scotland, 1495. A friar named John Corner was the distiller at Lindores Abbey in the Kingdom of Fife. Many Scotch whisky drinkers will refer to a unit for drinking as a dram. Regulations and labelling. Legal definition. As of November 23, 2009, the Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009 define and regulate the production, labelling, packaging as well as the advertising of Scotch whisky in the United Kingdom. They replace previous regulations that focused solely on production. International trade agreements have the effect of making some provisions of the SWR apply in various other countries as well as in the UK. The SWR defines Scotch whisky as whisky that is produced at a distillery in Scotland from water and malted barley, all of which have been processed at that distillery into a mash, converted at that distillery to a fermentable substrate only by endogenous enzyme systems, fermented at that distillery only by adding yeast, distilled at an alcoholic strength by volume of less than 94.8%. Wholly matured in an excise warehouse in Scotland in oak casks of a capacity not exceeding 700 litres for at least 3 years, retaining the colour, aroma, and taste of the raw materials used in, and the method of, its production and maturation, containing no added substances, other than water and plain caramel colouring, comprising a minimum alcoholic strength by volume of 40%. Labeling. A Scotch whisky label comprises several elements that indicate aspects of production, age, bottling, and ownership. Some of these elements are regulated by the SWR, and some reflect tradition and marketing. The spelling of the term whisky is often debated by journalists and consumers. Scottish, Australian and Canadian whiskies use whisky, Irish whiskies use whisky, while American and other styles vary in their spelling of the term. The label always features a declaration of the malt or grain whiskies used. A single malt Scotch whisky is one that is entirely produced from malt in one distillery. One may also encounter the term single cask, signifying the bottling comes entirely from one cask. The term blended malt signifies that single malt whisky from different distilleries are blended in the bottle. The Cardew distillery also began using the term pure malt for the same purpose, causing a controversy in the process over clarity in labelling. The Glenfiddich distillery was using the term to describe some single malt bottlings. As a result, the Scotch Whisky Association declared that a mixture of single malt whiskies must be labelled a blended malt. The use of the former terms vatted malt and pure malt is prohibited. The term blended malt is still debated, as some bottlers maintain that consumers confuse the term with blended Scotch whisky, which contains some proportion of grain whisky. The brand name featured on the label is usually the same as the distillery name. Indeed, the SWR prohibit bottlers from using a distillery name when the whisky was not made there. A bottler name may also be listed, sometimes independent of the distillery. In addition to requiring that Scotch whisky be distilled in Scotland, the SWR require that it also be bottled and labelled in Scotland. Labels may also indicate the region of the distillery. Alcoholic strength is expressed on the label with alcohol by volume, or sometimes simply vol. Typically, bottled whisky is between 40% and 46% ABV. Whisky is considerably stronger when first emerging from the cask, normally 63% ABV. Water is then added to create the desired bottling strength. If the whisky is not diluted before bottling, it can be labeled as cask strength. A whisky's age may be listed on the bottle providing a guarantee of the youngest whisky used. An age statement on the bottle, in the form of a number, must reflect the age of the youngest whisky used to produce that product. A whisky with an age statement is known as guaranteed age whisky. Scotch whisky without an age statement may, by law, be as young as 3 years old. In the early 21st century, such no-age statement whiskies became more common, as distilleries responded to the depletion of aged stocks caused by improved sales. A label may carry a distillation date or a bottling date. Whiskey does not mature once bottled, so if no age statement is provided, one may calculate the age of the whiskey if both the distillation date and bottling date are given. Labels may also carry various declarations of filtration techniques or final maturation processes. A Scotch whisky labelled as natural, or non-chill filtered has not been through a filtration process during bottling that removes compounds that some consumers see as desirable. Some whiskies are placed in different cask often sherry or port cask during a portion of maturation. Since this takes place at the end of the maturation process, these whiskies may be labelled as wood finished, sherry port finished, and so on. Types. There are 2 basic types of Scotch whisky, from which all blends are made. Single malt Scotch whisky means a Scotch whisky produced from only water and malted barley at a single distillery by batch distillation in pot stills. Single grain Scotch whisky means a Scotch whisky distilled at a single distillery but, in addition to water and malted barley, may involve whole grains of other malted or unmalted cereals. Single grain does not mean that only a single type of grain was used to produce the whisky. Rather, the adjective single refers only to the use of a single distillery. Excluded from the definition of a single grain Scotch whisky is any spirit that qualifies as a single malt Scotch whisky or as a blended Scotch whisky. The latter exclusion is to ensure that a blended Scotch whisky produced from single malt, S, and single grain, S, distilled at the same distillery does not also qualify as single grain Scotch whisky. 3 types of blends are defined for Scotch whisky. Blended malt Scotch whisky means a blend of 2 or more single malt Scotch whiskies from different distilleries. Blended grain Scotch whisky means a blend of 2 or more single grain Scotch whiskies from different distilleries. Blended Scotch whisky means a blend of 1 or more single malt Scotch whiskies with 1 or more single grain Scotch whiskies. The 5 Scotch whisky definitions are structured in such a way that the categories are mutually exclusive. The 2009 regulations changed the formal definition of blended Scotch whisky to achieve this result, but in a way that reflected traditional and current practice. Before the 2009 SWR, any combination of Scotch whiskies qualified as a blended Scotch whisky, including for example a blend of single malt Scotch whiskies. As was the case under the Scotch Whisky Act 1988, Regulation 5 of the SWR 2009 stipulates that the only whisky that may be manufactured in Scotland is Scotch whisky. The definition of manufacture is keeping for the purpose of maturation, and keeping, or using, for the purpose of blending, except for domestic blending for domestic consumption. This provision prevents the existence of 2 a grade is a unregistered trademark of whisky originating from Scotland. 1 a OE Scotch whisky and the other, a whisky product of Scotland that complies with the generic EU standard for whisky. According to the Scotch Whisky Association, allowing non-Scotch whisky production in Scotland would make it difficult to protect Scotch whisky as a distinctive product. Single grain. The majority of grain whisky produced in Scotland goes to make blended Scotch whisky. The average blended whisky is 60% a 85% grain whisky. Some higher quality grain whisky from a single distillery is bottled as single grain whisky. Blended malt whisky formerly called vatted malt or pure malt is one of the least common types of Scotch, a blend of single malts from more than one distillery. Blended malts contain only malt whiskies no grain whiskies and are usually distinguished from other types of whisky by the absence of the word single before malt on the bottle, and the absence of a distillery name. The age of the vat is that of the youngest of the original ingredients. For example, a blended malt marked 8 years old may include older whiskies, with the youngest constituent being 8 years old. Johnnie Walker Green Label and Monkey Shoulder are examples of blended malt whiskey. Starting from November 2011, no Scotch whiskey could be labeled as a vatted malt or pure malt, the SWR requiring them to be labeled blended malt instead. Blended Scotch whiskey constitutes about 90% of the whiskey produced in Scotland. Blended Scotch whiskies contain both malt whiskey and grain whiskey. Producers combine the various malts and grain whiskies to produce a consistent brand style. Notable blended Scotch whiskey brands include Bell's, Dewar's, Johnnie Walker, White and Mackay, Cutty Sark, J&B, The Famous Grouse, Ballantine's and Chivas Regal. Independent bottlers. Most malt distilleries sell a significant amount of whiskey by the cask for blending, and sometimes to private buyers as well. Whiskey from such casks is sometimes bottled as a single malt by independent bottling firms such as Duncan Taylor, Master of Malt, Gordon and MacPhail, Cadenheads, the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, Murray MacDavid, Berry Brothers and Rudd, Douglas Lying, and others. These are usually labelled with the distillery's name, but not using the distillery's trademarked logos or typefaces. An official bottling, by comparison, is from the distillery. Many independent bottlings are from single casks, and they may sometimes be very different from an official bottling. For a variety of reasons, some independent brands do not identify which facility distilled the whiskey in the bottle. They may instead identify only the general geographical area of the source, or they simply market the product using their own brand name without identifying their source. This may, in some cases, be simply to give the independent bottling company the flexibility to purchase from multiple distillers without changing their labels. History. To Friar John Corner, by order of the King, to make aqua vitae, 8 bowls of malt. According to the Scotch Whisky Association, Scotch whisky evolved from a Scottish drink called Witchbeatha, which means lively water, or water of life. The earliest record of distillation in Scotland occurred as long ago as 1494, as documented in the Exchequer Rolls, which were records of royal income and expenditure. The quote above records 8 bowls of malt given to Friar John Corner wherewith to make aqua vitae over the previous year. This would be enough for 1,500 bottles, which suggests that distillation was well established by the late 15th century. Whiskey production was first taxed in 1644, causing a rise in illicit whiskey distilling in the country. Around 1780, there were about 8 legal distilleries and 400 illegal ones. In 1823, Parliament eased restrictions on licensed distilleries with the Excise Act, while at the same time making it harder for the illegal stills to operate, thereby ushering in the modern era of Scotch production. 2 events helped to increase whiskey's popularity. First, the introduction in 1831 of the column still. The whiskey produced with this process was generally less expensive to produce and also less intense and smoother, because a column still can perform the equivalent of multiple distillation steps in a continuous distillation process. Second, the phylloxera bug destroyed wine and cognac production in France in 1880. Regions. Scotland was traditionally divided into 4 regions, the Highlands, Lowland, Islay, and Campbelltown. Speyside, encompassing the Spey River Valley in northeast Scotland, once considered part of the Highlands, has almost half of the total number of distilleries in Scotland within its geographic boundaries. Consequently, it is officially recognised as a distinct region. The Islands is not recognised as a region by the Scotch Whisky Association and is considered part of the Highlands region. Lowland only 3 distilleries remain in operation, Ashantoshan, Blodnotch, and Glenkinchie, and 1 more Daft Mill that is currently pending its first release. Speyside has the largest number of distilleries, which includes Arbella, Bilvenie, Cardew, Cragganmore, Glenfarclas, Glenlissoff, Glenfiddich, Speyburn, the Macallan, the Glenlivet, and the Glenross. Highland some Highland distilleries, Aberfeldy, Balblair, Ben Nevis, Dalmore, Dalwhinnie, Glenord, Glenmorangie, Oban, and Old Pulteney. The Islands, an unrecognised sub-region, includes all of the whiskey-producing islands, Arran, Jura, Mull, Orkney and Skye with their respective distilleries, Arran, Jura, Tobermory, Highland Park and Skerpa, and Talisker. Campbelltown, once home to over 30 distilleries, currently has only 3 distilleries operating, Glen Scotia, Glengyle and Springbank. Islay has 8 producing distilleries, Ardbeg, Bowmore, Bruichladdich, Benarpain, Caerlyle, Kilcoman, Lagavulin and Laphroaig. Although only 5 regions are specifically described, any Scottish locale may be used to describe a whisky if it is distilled entirely within that place. For example, a single malt whisky distilled on Orkney could be described as Orkney single malt Scotch whisky instead of as a Highland whisky. See also, List of whisky brands, List of whisky distilleries in Scotland, references, notes. Cited sources, Bender, David A. Dictionary of Food and Nutrition. Oxford, Oxford University Press. ISBN A978-0-19-860961-2. Hansel, John. What does a whisky's age really mean? Whisky Advocate. Retrieved March 17, 2012. MacLean, Charles. Whiskipedia, a compendium of Scottish whisky. Skyhorse Publishing. ISBN A978-1-61608-076-1. MacLean, Charles, Edwald Whisky, A Nation-by-Nation Guide to the Best. DK Publishing. ISBN A978-0-7566-5443-6. Jackson, Michael. Michael Jackson's Complete Guide to Single Malt Scotch. DK Publishing. ISBN A978-0-7566-5898-4. The Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009, Guidance for Producers and Bottlers. Scotch Whisky Association. December 2, 2009. Retrieved September 24, 2012. The Scotch Whisky Regulations 2009. UK Parliament 2009. Retrieved April 30, 2012. Other sources, Broom, Dave. Whisky a Connoisseur's Guide. London. Carlton Books Limited. ISBN 1-85868-706-3, Broom, Dave. Handbook of Whisky. London. Hamlin. ISBN 0-600-59846-2, Erskine, Kevin. The Instant Expert's Guide to Single Malt Scotch a Euro 2nd edition. Richmond, VA. Tessian Press. ISBN 0-9771991-8, MacLean, Charles. Scotch Whisky, A Liquid History. Castle Illustrated. ISBN 1-84403-078-4, Ishart, David. Whisky Classified a Euro 2nd edition. London. Pavilion Books. ISBN 1-86205-716-8, further reading, Henley, John. How the World Fell in Love with Scotch Whisky. The Guardian. Retrieved March 22, 2014. External links, Scotch Whisky Association, Distillery Pronunciation Guide, Scotch Whisky at DMOZ.